Welcome. Tonight, we embark on an inward journey, not upward into the distant cosmos, but inward into the vast landscape of the mind. We will explore a molecule so common, so familiar to billions of people across the world, that its presence often goes unnoticed. Yet this tiny chemical caffeine shapes consciousness itself, altering the very rhythm of human thought and awareness. For thousands of years, humans have sought this molecule in seeds and leaves, in bark and berries, brewing it into drinks that have powered civilizations, sparked revolutions, fueled artistic movements, and fundamentally changed how we experience time itself. Coffee shops line city streets like temples devoted to this single substance. Millions of people begin their day not with food, but with caffeine. They gather around tables, holding warm cups, waiting for that familiar lift of clarity and energy. But what is actually happening? What strange conversation occurs between this molecule and the 3 pounds of tissue behind your eyes? How does something so small create such profound changes in alertness, mood, and cognition? As you settle in, allow yourself to wonder about the invisible architecture of your own mind. The brain that ponders caffeine is itself transformed by caffeine. The consciousness that asks these questions is shaped by this very molecule. In understanding caffeine, we understand something essential about what it means to be human, about how we struggle against fatigue, how we seek clarity, and how we've learned to engineer our own awareness. So, breathe deeply, let your thoughts slow, and let us begin this exploration of the world within. The molecule that changed history. Caffeine is a simple thing when you reduce it to its essence. It is an alkaloid, a type of organic compound with nitrogen atoms woven into its structure. Its chemical name is 1,3,7-trimethylxanthine, but that formality masks something more poetic. It is one of nature's oldest tricks for staying awake. Plants have been producing caffeine for millions of years. In the leaves of the coffee plant, in the seeds of cacao, in the stems of the yerba mate, in the shoots of tea, caffeine appears again and again, created independently by different species across different continents. Why? The answer reveals something about the natural world. Caffeine is a pesticide. It is nature's defense mechanism. When insects consume caffeine, something extraordinary happens. The chemical disrupts their nervous systems, paralyzing them or killing them outright. For plants, caffeine is a weapon. It protects the precious leaves and seeds from predators. Yet humans, beings with far larger and more complex nervous systems, discovered that this very compound that repels insects produces the opposite effect in us. Instead of being paralyzed or harmed, we become more awake, more alert, more alive. The story of caffeine and human civilization is ancient and global. Coffee originated in Ethiopia, where the berries grew wild on mountain slopes. Legend tells of a goat herder named Kaldi, who noticed his animals becoming uncommonly energetic after eating coffee berries. Whether the story is true or not, it represents a profound moment, humans recognizing that this plant offered something they needed. Coffee spread northward through Arabia in the 15th century. Arab scholars and Sufi mystics drank it during long nights of prayer and contemplation. They understood something essential. Caffeine helped them stay present, alert, connected to their spiritual practices. The word coffee itself may derive from the Arabic kahwa, possibly meaning wine, suggesting the drink held serious significance in their culture. By the 17th century, coffee had reached Europe through Ottoman traders. Venetian merchants brought it to Italy. It spread to England, France, the Netherlands. In each place, it sparked something. Coffee houses opened establishments, entirely devoted to the consumption of this beverage. And in those coffee houses, something remarkable happened. Culture transformed. The coffee house became a place of intellectual ferment. Writers, philosophers, merchants, and artists gathered around tables, caffeine sharpening their minds, keeping them alert and engaged far longer than they could naturally sustain. In England, coffee houses were called penny universities because, for the price of a cup, anyone could sit and listen to the most brilliant minds of the age debate ideas. They were incubators of the Enlightenment. Before coffee houses, much human thinking happened in isolation. A scholar might spend hours alone, struggling against drowsiness, losing the thread of thought as fatigue pulled at them. But with caffeine, with coffee houses, thinking became communal. It became sustained. Hundreds of people could gather in a single room, all chemically sustained in a state of heightened alertness, all trading ideas and building on each other's thoughts. The scientific revolution, the age of enlightenment, the birth of modern science itself, all of it was fueled, quite literally, by caffeine. The great minds of the era were drinking coffee, tea, and chocolate, using these molecules to maintain focus and clarity through long nights of work. Isaac Newton, Voltaire, Beethoven, they were all caffeine users, though they would not have understood the biochemistry of what was happening. Across the world, parallel discoveries were being made. In China, tea had been consumed for thousands of years, but it was not until around the 8th century that tea drinking became widespread and culturally significant. Tea ceremonies evolved, becoming meditative practices centered around the consumption of this caffeinated leaf. In the Americas, indigenous peoples had long used yerba mate and cacao, both containing caffeine in rituals and daily life. By the 20th century, caffeine had become globalized in a way few substances ever have. Coffee and tea were grown on multiple continents. Coca-Cola, introduced in 1886, brought caffeine to the masses as a bottled soft drink. Energy drinks emerged later, offering concentrated doses of caffeine in portable forms. Today, caffeine is the most widely consumed psychoactive substance on Earth. Billions of people depend on it. Hundreds of billions of cups of coffee are consumed annually. The global caffeine market is worth tens of billions of dollars. Yet for most of human history, until the last 2 centuries, we did not understand what caffeine actually did. We felt its effects. We organized our lives around it. We built entire industries and social institutions around the consumption of caffeinated beverages. But the mechanism? That remained a mystery until relatively recently. It was not until 1819 that a German chemist named Friedrich Ferdinand Runge isolated caffeine for the first time. He extracted it from coffee beans, identified it as a distinct chemical compound, and named it. Even then, the world did not fully understand its function. It took nearly 150 more years of research to uncover the true mechanism of how caffeine affects the brain. And when scientists finally understood what was happening, when they mapped out the intricate dance between this molecule and the neural machinery of consciousness, they discovered something that changed everything. Caffeine does not create energy. It creates an illusion of energy by blocking our perception of fatigue, the brain's exhaustion signal. To understand caffeine, you must first understand fatigue. And to understand fatigue, you must understand a remarkable molecule called adenosine. Your brain is a voracious consumer of energy. Though it represents only about 2% of your body's mass, it uses approximately 20% of your body's energy at rest. Every thought you think, every memory you recall, every perception you process requires energy. That energy comes in the form of a molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It is the universal currency of biological energy, found in virtually every cell in your body. As your brain works, ATP is constantly broken down and rebuilt. This process is remarkably efficient, but it is not infinitely sustainable. As ATP is consumed, its breakdown produces a byproduct, adenosine. With each moment that passes, with each thought you think, with each second of wakefulness, adenosine accumulates in your brain. Adenosine is a signal. It is your brain's way of saying, "I am tired. I have been working. I need rest." It is, in essence, the voice of fatigue, speaking through chemistry. As adenosine levels rise throughout the day, they trigger increasingly powerful signals telling you to sleep. Adenosine molecules bind to receptors in your brain, called adenosine receptors. There are multiple types: A1 receptors, A2 receptors, A2B receptors, A3 receptors, scattered throughout different brain regions. When adenosine binds to these receptors, it produces a cascade of effects. The accumulation of adenosine creates what sleep researchers call sleep pressure. It is a biological imperative, building gradually throughout the day, pushing you inexorably toward rest. If you stay awake despite this pressure, adenosine continues to accumulate, and the pressure intensifies. After 24 hours without sleep, the sleep pressure is so powerful that humans become almost unable to stay conscious. The signals are overwhelming. This is where caffeine enters the story. Caffeine is what chemists call an antagonist, specifically an adenosine antagonist. This means it blocks adenosine from binding to its receptors. It does not destroy adenosine. It does not speed up its removal from the brain. It simply creates a barrier between adenosine and the receptors that would normally receive its signal. Think of it this way. Adenosine is a messenger trying to deliver a letter to your consciousness, saying, "You are tired, go to sleep." Caffeine is a postal worker who intercepts and assigns that letter before it reaches its destination. The message still exists, but you never receive it. The signal is blocked. This is why caffeine does not actually give you energy. If you measure the actual metabolic output of someone on caffeine versus someone without it, both use the same amount of energy. Caffeine does not increase your body's capacity to generate ATP. It does not make your muscles stronger or your mind sharper through chemical amplification. Instead, it does something more subtle and perhaps more profound. It deceives your brain about its own state of exhaustion. When you drink a cup of coffee, the caffeine enters your bloodstream. Within minutes, the exact timing varies based on individual metabolism, body weight, food intake, and other factors. But typically 15 to 45 minutes, caffeine reaches your brain. There, it begins binding to adenosine receptors, blocking adenosine from doing its job. Suddenly, the signals of fatigue stop. Your brain no longer receives the message that it is tired. The sleep pressure that was building collapses, at least perceptually. You feel alert. You feel awake. You feel like you have energy, even though your brain is still just as exhausted as it was before. The fatigue signal has simply been silenced. This is why caffeine is so dangerous if misused. It allows you to override one of your body's most important signals. It allows you to stay awake long past the point when you should be sleeping. It allows you to ignore the very mechanism that evolved to keep you healthy by ensuring adequate rest. But it also explains why caffeine is so valuable. There are times when it is genuinely useful to block fatigue signals. When you have important work to do, when you need to stay alert during a long drive, when circumstances demand sustained attention, and you genuinely need to postpone sleep in these moments, caffeine serves a real purpose. It allows you to maintain wakefulness when wakefulness is necessary. The key is understanding that this is what is actually happening. You are not gaining energy. You are sacrificing your body's error-checking system. You are choosing not to hear what your brain is trying to tell you about its own state of exhaustion. The brain's geography of caffeine sensitivity. Caffeine does not affect all brain regions equally. The brain is not a monolith, but rather a collection of distinct structures, each with its own function, its own chemistry, its own population of adenosine receptors. Because of this diversity, caffeine's effects ripple through the brain in complex and sometimes unexpected ways. Consider the prefrontal cortex, the region at the very front of your brain, just behind your forehead. This is the seat of executive function, the place where decisions are made, where impulse control happens, where you plan for the future and weigh consequences. The prefrontal cortex is rich in adenosine receptors, particularly A1 receptors. When adenosine builds up during a long day, these receptors become increasingly active, causing the prefrontal cortex to become sluggish. Your executive function deteriorates. Decision-making becomes harder. You become more impulsive, more prone to taking shortcuts, more likely to choose immediate gratification over long-term benefit. Caffeine, blocking these adenosine receptors, restores prefrontal function. This is why you feel sharper after coffee. This is why your thinking becomes clearer, your decisions more deliberate. The executive center of your brain is no longer receiving constant signals to shut down. But this is just one part of the story. Different adenosine receptors throughout the brain produce different effects when blocked by caffeine. A2, receptors in the striatum, a region deep in the brain involved in movement and motivation, get blocked by caffeine, and the result is increased motor activity and motivation. You do not just feel more alert, you feel more driven to act, to move, to do things. The locus coeruleus, a tiny structure in your brainstem, containing only about 3,000 neurons, far fewer than many brain regions, becomes more active when adenosine signaling is blocked. This region produces norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter involved in attention and arousal. When caffeine allows the locus coeruleus to fire more readily, attention sharpens. The world comes into focus. Distractions fade into the background. The amygdala, your brain's alarm center, the region that processes fear and emotional threats, also responds to caffeine. As adenosine builds up naturally, the amygdala becomes less reactive. You become calmer, less prone to anxiety. This is part of nature's design. As you become tired, you become less likely to perceive threats, less likely to panic. Your brain is preparing you for rest. But caffeine blocks this dampening effect. It keeps your amygdala in a more active state, making you more alert to potential dangers, more prone to experiencing anxiety. This is why caffeine can sometimes make people feel jittery or anxious. It is not creating anxiety from nothing, but rather preventing the natural dampening of your threat detection system. If you are already in a stressful situation, caffeine can amplify the stress. If you are already anxious, caffeine can deepen the anxiety. The substance does not discriminate. It blocks fatigue signals across the entire brain, including those that would normally keep negative emotions in check. The hippocampus, crucial for memory formation, also contains adenosine receptors. As adenosine accumulates, the hippocampus becomes less efficient at converting experiences into long-term memories. This is another aspect of how fatigue works. When you are exhausted, you do not form memories as efficiently. It is part of the preparation for sleep, a shifting of priorities. But caffeine, blocking this effect, allows the hippocampus to maintain its memory encoding capacity even when you are exhausted. You can stay awake through a long study session or work meeting and still form strong memories of what you learned. This is why students often use caffeine while studying. It is not just that caffeine keeps them awake. It is that caffeine specifically preserves the hippocampus's ability to encode memories, allowing them to learn material even when physically exhausted. The cerebellum, involved in coordination and balance, also becomes less precise as adenosine accumulates. This is part of the broad effect of fatigue on motor control. But caffeine restores this precision by blocking adenosine there as well. This is why pilots, athletes, and drivers often use caffeine. It maintains motor precision and coordination, even when tired. Understanding this geography of caffeine's effects reveals something important. Caffeine does not have a single effect. It has dozens of effects, all occurring simultaneously across different brain regions. The experience of being caffeinated is actually a complex symphony of changes in prefrontal function, motor arousal, attention, emotional processing, and memory formation, all happening at once. This is also why caffeine's effects vary so much from person to person. Genetic variations in adenosine receptors, differences in brain chemistry, variations in how quickly people metabolize caffeine, all of these contribute to individual differences in caffeine sensitivity. Some people experience caffeine as energizing and focusing. Others experience it as anxiety-inducing and destabilizing. Some people can drink coffee at 8 p.m. and fall asleep by 10 p.m. Others find that a single cup of coffee at lunchtime prevents sleep that night. None of these differences means one person is using caffeine correctly and another is not. It simply reflects the reality that human brains are diverse. The same molecule produces different outcomes depending on the unique neural architecture of each individual brain. The dance between caffeine and dopamine. As the sun moves across the sky, as the seasons turn, as years pass, human consciousness seeks stimulation. We are drawn to novelty, to excitement, to experiences that feel rewarding. This drive comes from a neurotransmitter called dopamine. It is not, as popular science often describes it, the pleasure chemical. That description is far too simple. Dopamine is more accurately described as the motivation chemical, the attention chemical, the salience chemical. It is what makes things feel important, what drives us to pursue goals, what makes us notice certain things and ignore others. The relationship between caffeine and dopamine is subtle but significant. While caffeine's primary mechanism involves blocking adenosine, it has secondary effects throughout the brain, and one of these involves dopamine signaling. When adenosine is not being blocked by caffeine, it acts on adenosine receptors throughout the brain's dopamine system. One key location is in the nucleus accumbens, a structure deep in the brain that is central to reward processing and motivation. When adenosine builds up there, it suppresses dopamine signaling. As you become tired, your brain becomes less motivated, less driven. Things that normally excite you seem less interesting. The reward system downregulates. But when caffeine blocks adenosine in the nucleus accumbens, this suppression is lifted. Dopamine signaling becomes more robust. The world becomes more salient, more interesting, more rewarding. Activities that seemed tedious become engaging. Tasks that felt boring suddenly feel worth doing. This is why caffeine so often pairs with enjoyment. People do not just drink coffee because they need to stay awake. They drink it because drinking coffee is pleasurable. The ritual of it, the warmth of the cup, the aroma, the taste, the social context is rewarding. And caffeine amplifies this reward by increasing dopamine signaling, making the experience feel even more valuable. This is also, however, where the seeds of dependency can grow. When something reliably produces an increase in dopamine signaling, the brain begins to anticipate that reward. You start to crave it. The pathway from the sight of a coffee cup to the expectation of dopamine release becomes reinforced. Eventually, your brain reorganizes itself around that anticipation. Without the coffee, without the dopamine bump, things feel less rewarding. Life seems duller, less motivating, less engaging. This is not addiction in the sense of heroin or cocaine addiction. Caffeine does not produce the same degree of dopamine dysregulation or create physical dependence as severe as those substances, but it is a genuine form of psychological dependence. Your brain has reorganized its reward system around the expectation of caffeine. Remove caffeine, and the world temporarily becomes less rewarding, less engaging, less motivated. This also means that caffeine's effect on dopamine can be self-perpetuating. The more you use caffeine, the more you reorganize your brain around it. The dopamine boost you get from caffeine becomes the new baseline for what feels rewarding. Non-caffeinated activities feel increasingly dull by comparison. This is why long-term caffeine users often report that taking a break from caffeine reveals how dependent they have become. Without it, nothing feels as engaging. But there is another layer to this relationship between caffeine and dopamine that is worth exploring. Caffeine's effect on dopamine varies across different brain regions and different types of dopamine receptors, just as its effect on adenosine does. In some regions, caffeine increases dopamine signaling. In others, the effects are more complex or even counterintuitive. The prefrontal cortex, for instance, has a particular relationship with dopamine that is crucial for executive function. Optimal prefrontal function does not require maximal dopamine signaling. Instead, there is an inverted, U-shaped curve. Too little dopamine, and the prefrontal cortex is sluggish and unfocused. Too much dopamine, and the prefrontal cortex becomes impulsive and scattered. The sweet spot is in the middle. This is called the Yerkes-Dodson law, and it applies to arousal in general. There is an optimal level of arousal for any given task, and too much is just as bad as too little. This means that caffeine can actually impair prefrontal function in some situations. If you are already in a state of high arousal, already alert, already focused, already in a state of optimal prefrontal dopamine signaling, adding caffeine can push you into a state of excessive dopamine, reducing focus and increasing impulsivity. This is why some people report that too much coffee makes them scattered rather than focused. They have crossed the threshold from optimal arousal to excessive arousal. The interplay between caffeine, adenosine, and dopamine creates a complex landscape of effects that vary not just from person to person, but from moment to moment in the same person's brain. Your reaction to caffeine depends on your current level of fatigue, your current level of arousal, your recent caffeine consumption, your genetics, the time of day, your emotional state, and numerous other factors. The circadian dance, caffeine, and your internal clock. Deep within the brain, nestled just above where the optic nerves cross, lies a structure called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It is tiny, only about 20,000 neurons, but its influence on human consciousness and physiology is immense. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is your brain's master clock. It generates your circadian rhythm, the approximately 24-hour biological cycle that governs sleep and wakefulness, appetite, body temperature, hormone secretion, and hundreds of other physiological processes. The suprachiasmatic nucleus operates largely independently of conscious control. Even if you were isolated in a dark room with no way to tell time, your body would still cycle through waking and sleeping phases roughly every 24 hours. This internal clock is not perfectly precise. Most people's natural circadian rhythm is slightly longer than 24 hours, typically between 24.5 and 25 hours, but it provides the fundamental structure of human temporality. Light is the primary signal that synchronizes the circadian clock to the actual 24-hour day. When light hits the retina in the morning, signals travel to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. effectively resetting the clock and saying, "It is morning." This signal triggers the release of cortisol and other hormones that promote wakefulness. It suppresses melatonin, the hormone that promotes sleep. Throughout the day, as adenosine accumulates, sleep pressure builds. But the circadian clock is also signaling your body to stay awake, at least until evening. Around dusk, when light fades, a dramatic shift occurs. The suprachiasmatic nucleus receives the signal that darkness is falling. It reduces the output of wakefulness-promoting signals. It increases the output of sleep-promoting signals. Melatonin levels rise. Your body temperature drops slightly. Your metabolism slows. Everything in your physiology is being orchestrated by this tiny cluster of neurons in the center of your brain, preparing you for sleep. This is where caffeine becomes particularly interesting from a circadian perspective. Caffeine does not directly interfere with the circadian clock. The suprachiasmatic nucleus continues to generate its rhythm regardless of caffeine consumption. But by blocking adenosine receptors throughout the brain, caffeine can mask the circadian signals that promote sleep, at least for a time. If you drink caffeine in the afternoon, it blocks the adenosine that would normally be building up and signaling your body to prepare for sleep. Even as the circadian clock is sending increasingly strong signals that it is time to wind down, caffeine is preventing the complementary adenosine signal from reinforcing that message. Your body receives mixed signals. The circadian clock says, "It is evening, prepare for sleep." The adenosine blockade says, "You are not tired." For a few hours, the adenosine blockade can override the circadian signals. But there is only so much caffeine in your system, and it eventually gets metabolized. As caffeine wears off, adenosine is no longer blocked, and it suddenly floods back in, creating an effect researchers call the caffeine crash. But by this time, the circadian window for sleep may have passed. It is often around 10 or 11 p.m. when caffeine from afternoon consumption finally wears off, but your circadian clock, now confused by the disruption earlier, may not be sending strong sleep signals anymore. This can create a vicious cycle. Unable to sleep at the normal circadian time due to afternoon caffeine, you stay up later. Your sleep is shorter or more fragmented. You wake up tired the next morning. To combat this tiredness, you drink more coffee. The caffeine again disrupts your circadian rhythm. Night after night, the rhythm becomes more distorted. This is why sleep hygienists recommend avoiding caffeine after 2 or 3 p.m. The half-life of caffeine, the time it takes for your body to eliminate half of it, is typically 5 to 6 hours in most people, though it can vary from 3 to 7 hours, depending on individual factors like age, pregnancy, liver function, and genetic variations in caffeine metabolizing enzymes. A cup of coffee consumed at 3 p.m. means that at 9 p.m., half of it is still in your system. At 3 a.m., a quarter of it remains. Even this residual amount can be enough to prevent sleep in sensitive individuals. But there is something more interesting happening here. Beyond simple pharmacology, humans did not evolve to drink caffeine. Our circadian clocks evolved in a world without caffeinated beverages. When caffeine disrupts the circadian rhythm night after night, it creates a state of chronic circadian misalignment. Your internal clock is telling your body one thing, but your caffeine-masked adenosine signaling is telling it another. Over time, this constant misalignment has real consequences. Chronically disrupted circadian rhythms are associated with increased risk of metabolic disorders, cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, and mood disorders. They are associated with increased inflammation throughout the body. They disrupt the normal timing of hormone secretion, nutrient absorption, and cellular repair. The circadian rhythm is not a luxury or a minor physiological feature. It is fundamental to health. When caffeine chronically disrupts the circadian rhythm, it sets off a cascade of downstream problems. This is why night shift workers who rely on caffeine to stay awake during their working hours experience higher rates of health problems than day workers. This is why teenagers who start high school earlier than their natural wake time and use caffeine to stay alert report more mental health issues. The caffeine is solving the immediate problem of wakefulness, but it is creating larger problems by disrupting the circadian system. There is also an interesting asymmetry in caffeine's interaction with circadian rhythms. Caffeine is much more effective at preventing sleep in the evening than it is at promoting wakefulness in the morning. This is because, in the morning, the circadian clock is already strongly signaling wakefulness. Caffeine reinforces this signal, but it is not doing the primary work. The circadian clock is. In the evening, however, the circadian clock is sending powerful sleep-promoting signals. Caffeine directly opposes these signals by blocking adenosine. The circadian clock and the adenosine blocking action of caffeine are working against each other, and often the adenosine blockade wins, at least temporarily. This is why morning coffee feels like it enhances natural wakefulness, while evening coffee feels like it is fighting against your biology. But even morning caffeine has circadian effects. If you drink caffeine every single morning, your body begins to anticipate it. Your circadian clock actually shifts its phase slightly to account for the timing of regular caffeine use. The brain learns, caffeine comes at 7 a.m. Adjust the circadian rhythm accordingly. Then, one weekend, when you sleep late and do not have your usual 7 a.m. coffee, you might experience strange circadian effects, dizziness, disorientation, a sense that your body is out of sync with external time. This is because your circadian clock was phase shifted around the expectation of morning caffeine, and that expectation was violated. The chemistry of addiction, how your brain adapts to caffeine addiction, is a loaded word. When people hear it applied to caffeine, many react with skepticism. Caffeine is legal, widely available, socially accepted, and not associated with the severe health and social consequences of drugs like heroin or methamphetamine. And these distinctions are valid. Caffeine addiction is not equivalent to heroin addiction, but that does not mean the fundamental mechanisms are entirely different. In fact, understanding how caffeine interacts with the brain's adaptive systems provides a fascinating window into neuroadaptation itself. When you first encounter caffeine, your brain responds to the adenosine blockade with appropriate changes in wakefulness, alertness, and dopamine signaling. But your brain is not static. It is constantly adapting to its environment. This adaptation process is called sensitization, when the brain becomes more responsive to a stimulus, and desensitization, or tolerance, when the brain becomes less responsive. With repeated caffeine use, a process of tolerance typically develops. After a few days of regular caffeine consumption, you notice that your morning coffee is not quite as effective as it was the first time you drank coffee. You feel alert, but not as alert as you did before. This is not because you have stopped absorbing caffeine or because your metabolism has changed. It is because your brain has adapted. The primary mechanism of tolerance to caffeine involves changes in adenosine receptor density and receptor sensitivity. When your brain is regularly exposed to caffeine, which blocks adenosine receptors, it responds by producing more adenosine receptors. This is called upregulation. Your brain is attempting to maintain its normal level of adenosine signaling despite the presence of caffeine blocking some receptors. This upregulation is a form of homeostasis, the brain's constant attempt to maintain internal balance. If adenosine is being blocked by caffeine, the brain compensates by making more receptors so that adenosine can still signal despite the blockade. It is an elegant system, but it has a consequence. You need more caffeine to achieve the same effect. This is tolerance, and it explains the common experience of long-term caffeine users who find they need larger and larger doses to feel the same effect. A person who first tries coffee might feel noticeably alert after 1 cup. Months later, after daily caffeine consumption, they might need 2 or 3 cups to feel the same level of alertness. But tolerance is not the end of the story. The changes in your brain go deeper. With chronic caffeine use, receptors do not just increase in number, their sensitivity also changes. Some adenosine receptors become desensitized. They do not respond as strongly to adenosine, even when it does bind to them. This is yet another compensatory mechanism. The brain is trying to maintain normal functioning despite chronic adenosine antagonism. There are also changes in the expression of genes related to adenosine signaling. With chronic caffeine use, your brain upregulates the production of adenosine itself. You are producing more of the fatigue signal, even as you are blocking it with caffeine. This is another sign of homeostatic adaptation. Your brain is trying to override the adenosine blockade by simply producing more adenosine. These neural adaptations create what happens when you stop caffeine: withdrawal. Many people have experienced this. After days or weeks of daily caffeine consumption, if you suddenly stop consuming caffeine, you feel dramatically worse than you did before you ever started using caffeine. You feel exhausted, foggy, unable to concentrate. You might have headaches, body aches, and mood disturbances. The reason is clear now. Your brain has adapted to constant adenosine blockade. It has upregulated adenosine receptors, producing more adenosine, becoming less sensitive to adenosine signaling. When caffeine is suddenly removed, all of this adenosine that your brain is producing floods into all of these receptors that are now oversensitized to adenosine. The signal is overwhelming. Your brain is receiving a massive dose of fatigue signal after being adapted to blocking it. This is why caffeine withdrawal can be genuinely unpleasant, though it is not medically dangerous. It is not equivalent to withdrawal from opioids, which can cause seizures and organ failure, but it is real. The discomfort can last days or weeks as your brain gradually readapts to a world without caffeine. Interestingly, not everyone develops tolerance to caffeine at the same rate or to the same degree. Genetic variations play a role. Some people have genetic variations that make them rapid caffeine metabolizers. They break down caffeine quickly and are less affected by tolerance. Others are slow metabolizers who accumulate caffeine in their system more readily and develop tolerance more quickly. There is also individual variation in adenosine receptor genes themselves. Some people's adenosine receptors are naturally more or less sensitive to adenosine and to adenosine antagonists like caffeine. This variation, which emerges early in life, predisposes some people toward greater caffeine sensitivity and others toward lower caffeine sensitivity. These genetic factors help explain why some people can drink coffee all day and sleep easily at night, while others find a single cup of coffee disrupts their sleep profoundly. The tolerance that develops to caffeine is also incomplete. You never develop complete tolerance where caffeine has no effect at all, no matter how much you take. There is always an effect, though it diminishes with use. This incomplete tolerance distinguishes caffeine from some other drugs, where tolerance can become so severe that doses become dangerously large. The process of developing tolerance to caffeine and the experience of caffeine withdrawal teaches us something important about how the brain works. It is not a fixed system, but a dynamic one, constantly adapting to maintain homeostasis. Every chemical input triggers adaptive responses. Every stimulus shapes the brain's circuitry. We are not passive recipients of drug effects, but active participants in a dance between external chemicals and internal neural adaptation. The focus effect. how caffeine changes your attention. In the ancient world, there was no concept of attention deficit. People did not need to focus on a single task for 8 continuous hours. Life proceeded at a different pace. Work was often seasonal, interrupted by weather and daylight. Reading and writing were rare skills, practiced by a tiny elite. The demands on sustained attention were fundamentally different from modern life. Today, we have engineered a world that demands unprecedented levels of sustained, focused attention. Computers require that you sit in one place, staring at a screen, performing intricate cognitive tasks for hours at a time. School systems demand that children sit quietly and absorb information for entire days. Office workers must maintain focus on projects, despite constant digital interruptions. The modern world is, in many ways, a test of attentional capacity. Caffeine became essential to this world because it directly enhances attentional capacity. But understanding how it does this requires understanding attention itself, what it is, how it works, and where it fails. Attention is not a single function, but a collection of related processes. There is selective attention, the ability to focus on one thing while ignoring others. There is sustained attention, the ability to maintain focus on a single task over time. There is divided attention, the ability to split focus between multiple tasks. There is also orienting attention, the ability to rapidly shift focus from one thing to another based on changing priorities or environmental demands. Each of these attentional processes involves specific neural networks and neurotransmitters. The frontoparietal control network, involving the prefrontal cortex and posterior parietal cortex, is crucial for directing attention. The ventral attention network, involving the temporoparietal junction and ventral prefrontal cortex, helps detect salient information and reorient attention when something unexpected happens. The default mode network, active when you are not focused on external tasks, becomes suppressed when you are attending to something. All of these networks communicate through multiple neurotransmitters: dopamine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, GABA, and glutamate. Adenosine, which we have already discussed in the context of fatigue, also plays a role in attention. As adenosine accumulates with fatigue, adenosine receptors in the frontoparietal and ventral attention networks become increasingly active. This inhibits these networks' function. Your ability to sustain attention decays. Your mind wanders. You become distracted by things that would normally be easy to ignore. Caffeine, blocking adenosine in these attention networks, restores their normal function. The inhibition is lifted. The networks can fire more robustly. You become able to concentrate, to focus, to direct your attention toward a goal and maintain that direction despite distractions. But caffeine's effect on attention goes beyond simply blocking fatigue signals. Caffeine also influences dopamine and norepinephrine systems that are crucial for attention. By blocking adenosine in the nucleus accumbens and related reward regions, caffeine increases dopamine signaling. This increased dopamine enhances the salience of the task you are focusing on. It makes the task feel more important, more engaging, more worth your attention. Tasks that normally feel tedious become more interesting. Your motivation to focus increases. Similarly, caffeine's influence on the locus coeruleus, which produces norepinephrine, enhances arousal and attentional capacity. The norepinephrine system is involved in maintaining an optimal level of alertness and in detecting important information in the environment. Increased norepinephrine signaling makes you more alert to your task and to potentially important information related to it. The combination of these effects, blocking fatigue signals in attention networks, increasing dopamine, increasing norepinephrine, creates a state that is subjectively experienced as focus. The world narrows. Distractions fade. Time seems to pass differently. You are in what Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi called flow, a state of optimal engagement, where skill meets challenge and action flows without conscious deliberation. This is why students study with coffee. This is why writers drink coffee before writing. This is why programmers surround themselves with empty coffee cups. The substance genuinely enhances the attentional capacity necessary for these complex cognitive tasks. It is not just placebo or habit. There are real neurochemical changes that support enhanced focus. However, there is a paradox at the heart of caffeine and attention. While caffeine enhances overall attentional capacity, it can also fragment attention in certain situations. If you consume too much caffeine, if you are in an already high-stress state, if the adenosine blockade crosses a threshold into excessive arousal, you can experience what feels like scattered attention. You are aware of everything, distracted by everything. You cannot settle your focus because your nervous system is too activated. This ties back to the inverted U relationship between arousal and performance. There is an optimal level of arousal for any given task. Too little arousal, and you cannot focus. Too much arousal, and you cannot focus either. The inverted U relationship means that more is not always better. This is why caffeine's effectiveness for attention varies so much depending on context. For a sleep-deprived student trying to study late at night, caffeine is profoundly helpful. It restores attentional capacity to a functional level. For someone who is already well-rested, already focused, already in a state of optimal arousal, adding caffeine might push them past the optimal point, actually impairing focus. The neuroscientist Daniel Kahneman distinguished between two modes of thinking: System 1, which is automatic and fast, and System 2, which is deliberate and slow. System 1 requires minimal attention. It is what kicks in when you are doing something familiar or routine. System 2 requires sustained, focused attention. It is what you use when you are learning something new, solving a difficult problem, or making an important decision. Caffeine primarily enhances System 2 thinking. It increases your capacity for deliberate, focused, effortful cognition. But this comes at a cost in certain situations. When you are in a state of heightened arousal from caffeine, you become less able to engage System 1 thinking in situations where it would normally be useful. You become more deliberate, more careful, but also sometimes less fluid and intuitive. This is why creative people sometimes report that too much caffeine inhibits their creativity. Creativity often requires a state of mind that is alert but not overly focused, engaged but not rigidly goal-directed. The inverted U relationship appears here as well. Moderate caffeine enhances creativity by increasing dopamine in the frontostriatal networks involved in creative cognition. But excessive caffeine can push arousal too high, constraining the flexible, associative thinking that creativity requires. The effect of caffeine on attention also has a temporal dimension. Caffeine does not enhance attention equally throughout the time it is in your system. When caffeine levels are rising in the first 30 to 90 minutes after consumption, the effect on attention is typically greatest. You feel most focused, most able to concentrate, as caffeine levels plateau and then begin to decline. The attentional benefit plateaus as well. By the time caffeine is significantly metabolized, the attentional enhancement has faded. This is why many people drink multiple cups of coffee throughout the day, rather than one large cup in the morning. The pattern of drinking allows them to ride successive waves of peak caffeine concentration, each wave providing another window of enhanced focus. But this pattern also means continuous adenosine receptor blockade throughout the day, preventing adenosine from accumulating and signaling fatigue. One interesting phenomenon that some regular caffeine users report is that after months or years of daily caffeine consumption, they become unable to focus without caffeine, even on tasks that they could focus on before they started using caffeine. This suggests that chronic caffeine use may create lasting changes in attention networks. The brain adapts to chronic adenosine blockade, and when caffeine is absent, attention suffers more than it would have if the person had never used caffeine in the first place. This is a cautionary note about caffeine use. It is not simply an additive to cognitive function. It is a drug that changes your brain's baseline capacity for attention. Long-term use does improve attention that is real, but it also means you become dependent on that improvement. Remove caffeine, and you discover that your baseline attentional capacity is now lower than it was before you started using caffeine regularly. Caffeine's paradoxical effects. The role of individual differences. One of the most interesting aspects of caffeine is how differently it affects different people. This is not a matter of belief or expectation. It is not placebo. It is genuinely rooted in biology. Some of the most important differences have to do with genetics, particularly variations in how people metabolize caffeine. The primary enzyme responsible for metabolizing caffeine is called CYP1A2. This enzyme is produced by your liver, and it is responsible for breaking down about 95% of the caffeine you consume. The remaining 5% is metabolized by other enzymes and eventually excreted unchanged. Genetic variations in the gene that codes for CYP1A2 create different versions of the enzyme that work at different speeds. Some people have a fast metabolizing version of the enzyme. They break down caffeine quickly and do not accumulate much in their system. For these rapid metabolizers, caffeine has a much shorter half-life, perhaps 3 to 4 hours. They feel the effects acutely but briefly. Other people have a slow metabolizing version of the enzyme. Caffeine accumulates in their system and takes much longer to clear. For these slow metabolizers, the half-life of caffeine might be 7 to 10 hours, or even longer. They feel the effects more intensely and for much longer. This genetic difference has dramatic practical implications. For a rapid metabolizer, drinking coffee at 3 p.m. might produce minimal sleep disruption. For a slow metabolizer, that same cup of coffee might prevent sleep that night. Neither person is using caffeine wrong. They simply have different biology. Studies examining the relationship between CYP1A2 genotype and caffeine effects have found that slow metabolizers experience greater benefits from caffeine's alerting effects, but also experience greater negative effects, like anxiety and sleep disruption. They also show greater increases in cardiovascular markers like blood pressure and heart rate when consuming caffeine. Rapid metabolizers, meanwhile, show more modest effects. Overall, both benefits and risks are smaller. This genetic variation also influences how different people experience caffeine dependence. Slow metabolizers, who accumulate caffeine to higher levels, develop tolerance more quickly and experience more severe withdrawal when they stop. Rapid metabolizers, who never accumulate as much caffeine, develop tolerance more slowly and experience milder withdrawal. There are other genetic variations that influence caffeine response as well. Variations in adenosine receptor genes create differences in how sensitive your adenosine receptors are to adenosine and in how readily they upregulate in response to chronic caffeine use. Variations in dopamine receptor genes influence how sensitive your reward system is to the dopamine effects of caffeine. Some people have genetic variations that make them naturally more alert and focused. For these people, caffeine produces less of an improvement because they are already at a high baseline. Others have a naturally lower baseline of alertness. For them, caffeine produces a more dramatic improvement. Beyond genetics, age influences caffeine response. Caffeine metabolism is slower in older adults than in younger adults. The elderly may experience stronger and longer-lasting effects of caffeine. Pregnancy also dramatically slows caffeine metabolism. Pregnant women metabolize caffeine about twice as slowly as non-pregnant women. This is why medical organizations recommend that pregnant women reduce caffeine consumption. The same dose produces higher peak levels and longer duration in pregnant women. Medications also influence caffeine metabolism. Birth control pills slow caffeine metabolism, as do certain antidepressants and other medications. If you start taking a medication and suddenly find that caffeine affects you more strongly, this might be because the medication is interfering with your CYP1A2 enzyme. Caffeine metabolism also changes throughout the day. This might seem strange, but your body's production of metabolic enzymes follows circadian rhythms. CYP1A2 production is higher in the morning and evening than at midday. This means the same amount of caffeine consumed at different times of day will be metabolized at different rates. Caffeine consumed in the morning is metabolized more quickly than caffeine consumed at noon. There are also differences in caffeine sensitivity related to gender. Some studies have found that women are more sensitive to caffeine's effects than men, showing greater increases in anxiety and sleep disruption. However, the evidence on this point is mixed, and much of what we observe may be due to differences in body weight, caffeine dose per unit of body weight, rather than true gender differences in sensitivity. Stress level influences how you experience caffeine. During times of high stress, you produce more cortisol and adrenaline. Caffeine amplifies these stress hormones. For someone already in a state of high stress, caffeine can turn background anxiety into full-blown panic. Conversely, for someone in a low-stress state, caffeine is purely activating and focusing. Emotional state influences caffeine response as well. If you are already experiencing depression or low mood, caffeine might help by increasing dopamine signaling and lifting mood slightly. If you are already experiencing anxiety, caffeine can deepen the anxiety by blocking adenosine's natural anxiety dampening effects and by increasing heart rate and physiological arousal. Even your microbiome influences caffeine metabolism. The bacteria in your gut produce metabolites and enzymes that affect how caffeine is processed. Recent research has found that people with different bacterial compositions in their gut show different responses to caffeine. The diversity of your microbiome influences the diversity of your responses to drugs. All of these factors, genetic, physiological, psychological, environmental, combine to create a unique profile of caffeine sensitivity for each individual. This is why it is impossible to make a universal statement about the effects of caffeine. The statement, "Caffeine improves focus," is true for many people in many situations, but it is false for others in other situations. The statement, "Caffeine disrupts sleep," is true for many people, false for others. "Caffeine increases anxiety," is true for some, not true for others. Understanding this individuality is crucial for anyone thinking about their own caffeine use. It is not enough to know what caffeine does in general. You need to understand what it does to you specifically. This requires careful observation and honesty about your own experience. It requires distinguishing between placebo effects and real effects, between expectation and actual experience. It requires understanding your own genetics, your own metabolism, your own psychology, well enough to predict how you will respond. The body responds beyond the brain. While most of caffeine's effects occur in the brain through adenosine receptor blockade, caffeine also has significant effects throughout the body. These effects are less direct than the effects in the brain, but they are no less important for understanding how caffeine changes your overall physiology and health. One of the most significant body-wide effects of caffeine is on the cardiovascular system. When adenosine levels are high, which happens when you are fatigued, adenosine acts on adenosine receptors throughout your blood vessels, causing vasodilation, blood vessel widening. This lowers blood pressure. It is part of your body's natural wind-down process as you prepare for sleep. But when caffeine blocks adenosine throughout your body, including in your blood vessels, this vasodilation does not occur. Blood vessels remain constricted. Blood pressure rises. Heart rate increases. These effects vary based on how much caffeine you consume and how sensitive you are to it. But they are real and measurable, even in people who do not notice them subjectively. For people with high blood pressure or cardiovascular disease, the cardiovascular effects of caffeine can be significant enough to be medically concerning. A surge in blood pressure or heart rate, though temporary, can trigger events like arrhythmias or angina in susceptible individuals. This is why cardiologists often recommend that their patients with heart conditions limit caffeine. For healthy young people, the temporary increase in blood pressure and heart rate from caffeine is usually not dangerous. But it is worth noting that chronic elevation of these cardiovascular markers is associated with increased risk of heart disease over time. If you are a chronic caffeine user, you are maintaining chronically elevated blood pressure and heart rate, even if the elevation is modest. Over decades, this could contribute to cardiovascular disease risk. Caffeine also affects your kidneys. Adenosine, when it accumulates, promotes vasoconstriction in your kidneys, reducing kidney blood flow and producing a slight antidiuretic effect, meaning adenosine helps your body retain water. When caffeine blocks adenosine in your kidneys, this effect is reversed. Your kidneys increase blood flow slightly, and you produce more urine. This is why caffeine is a mild diuretic. However, the diuretic effect of caffeine is often exaggerated. Regular caffeine users develop tolerance to the diuretic effect, just as they develop tolerance to the alerting effect. After a few days of caffeine consumption, you stop experiencing increased urination even though you continue to consume caffeine. This is why the popular belief that you should not count caffeinated beverages toward your daily fluid intake is partially incorrect. Yes, caffeine is a mild diuretic, but the diuretic effect is small and decreases rapidly with repeated use. Caffeine also stimulates the release of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. This is an indirect effect, mediated through caffeine's effects on the brain. The increased alertness and arousal that caffeine produces stimulates your sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight system. Your body releases hormones as if you are in a stressful situation, even if you are just sitting at your desk drinking coffee. This stress hormone release has consequences. In the short term, it is usually harmless and even beneficial. Cortisol and adrenaline increase your energy, improve your focus, and prepare your body for action. But if you are chronically consuming caffeine, you are chronically stimulating the release of these stress hormones. Over time, chronic elevation of stress hormones has real health consequences. It increases inflammation throughout your body. It impairs immune function, increasing susceptibility to infections. It affects glucose metabolism, potentially contributing to metabolic dysfunction. It alters fat distribution, promoting abdominal obesity. It affects bone metabolism, potentially contributing to osteoporosis. Chronic stress hormone elevation is associated with increased risk of depression, anxiety, and cognitive decline. This means that while caffeine can feel like a helpful tool for managing fatigue and improving performance, it comes with a metabolic cost, especially if used chronically and heavily. Caffeine also affects your digestive system. It stimulates the production of stomach acid and increases the contractions of your digestive tract. For some people, This can be beneficial. Caffeine can improve digestion and help with constipation. For others, especially those with acid reflux or ulcers, caffeine can exacerbate symptoms. The increased stomach acid can irritate the esophagus or stomach lining, and the increased intestinal contractions can trigger symptoms in people with irritable bowel syndrome. Caffeine also affects your skeleton. Regular caffeine consumption increases calcium excretion through your urine slightly. This does not necessarily lead to bone loss if you have adequate dietary calcium, but over decades of heavy caffeine consumption, this increased calcium loss could contribute to osteoporosis, especially in people with marginal calcium intake or those with genetic predispositions to osteoporosis. Caffeine also influences body temperature. The stress hormones released by caffeine increase your metabolic rate slightly, producing a small increase in heat production. This is why caffeine is sometimes used in weight loss supplements. It modestly increases energy expenditure. However, the effect is small, typically only increasing calorie burn by about 5% for a few hours after consumption. This is not enough to produce significant weight loss without other dietary and exercise changes. One particularly interesting body-wide effect of caffeine involves your eyes. Caffeine constricts blood vessels in your eyes, reducing blood flow to the eyes slightly. This can improve visual acuity for some tasks, as less blood flow means reduced light scatter in the eye. But it also increases intraocular pressure in people with glaucoma or predisposition to glaucoma. For people with these conditions, heavy caffeine consumption could theoretically increase glaucoma risk. Caffeine also affects your endocrine system more broadly. It influences the release of reproductive hormones in complex ways. Some studies have suggested that heavy caffeine consumption might affect fertility, though the evidence is mixed and often confounded by other lifestyle factors. Caffeine also affects thyroid function in ways that are still not completely understood, though the effects are generally modest. All of these body-wide effects of caffeine remind us that the brain does not exist in isolation. When we ingest a drug like caffeine, it affects not just your thoughts and consciousness, but your entire organism. It changes your heart rate, your blood pressure, your hormones, your digestion, your temperature regulation, your bone metabolism. The caffeine you drink is woven into the fabric of your physiology. The development of caffeine sensitivity, from infancy to old age, caffeine's effects on human neurology change across the lifespan. At different ages, caffeine produces different effects, and what is a reasonable dose for an adult might be inappropriate for a child or elderly person. In infancy, caffeine has essentially no place. Babies do not consume caffeine naturally, and pediatricians recommend that parents avoid giving babies caffeinated beverages. Babies' metabolic systems are not fully developed, and they are unable to efficiently metabolize caffeine. More importantly, babies' brains are still developing at a rapid pace, and the effects of adenosine are particularly important during this development. Adenosine plays a crucial role in brain development, promoting the formation of connections between neurons and the elimination of unnecessary connections. Blocking adenosine with caffeine during this critical developmental period could theoretically interfere with normal brain development. In early childhood, caffeine is still not present in most children's diets. Young children rely on natural sleep cycles and high physical activity levels to manage their alertness. They do not need caffeine because their circadian system is strong, their adenosine regulation is normal, and they are generally more physically active than adults. But in adolescence, something changes. Teenagers often start to consume caffeine in the form of sodas, energy drinks, tea, and coffee. This is also a period when sleep debt often accumulates due to early school start times that conflict with teenagers' natural circadian rhythms, which shift later during adolescence. This combination, sleep debt plus caffeine to combat the tiredness from that sleep debt, often accelerates into chronic caffeine consumption and chronic sleep deprivation. During adolescence, the teenage brain is still developing, particularly the prefrontal cortex and the systems that regulate mood, impulse control, and decision-making. Caffeine, by blocking adenosine and disrupting circadian rhythms, can interfere with this development. Studies have found that teenagers who consume high levels of caffeine show increased rates of anxiety, sleep disruption, and behavioral problems compared to teenagers who do not consume caffeine. The caffeine sleep deprivation cycle during adolescence can establish patterns that persist into adulthood. Teenagers who develop dependence on caffeine during these years often carry that dependence forward, creating chronic reliance on caffeine just to maintain baseline functioning. In young adulthood, caffeine use often peaks. Young adults balance work, education, social life, and often insufficient sleep. Caffeine becomes a tool for managing this imbalance. Young adult brains are now fully developed, and the neurotoxic concerns about interfering with development are less acute. The prefrontal cortex is now mature, though it does not reach full maturity until the mid-20s. This is the stage of life where caffeine is most effective and most benign, relatively speaking. The mature brain has the full complement of adenosine receptors and metabolic machinery to deal with caffeine. Young adults can typically tolerate fairly high levels of caffeine without serious health consequences. However, during young adulthood, the patterns of caffeine dependence and the cascading effects of caffeine on sleep quality become established. Caffeine use during this period often sets the stage for lifelong patterns. In middle age, the story becomes more complex. Caffeine metabolism begins to slow as people age. What felt like a moderate dose in young adulthood begins to have stronger effects. Sleep quality often deteriorates with age, and caffeine's sleep-disrupting effects become more pronounced. Women entering perimenopause and menopause often experience increased caffeine sensitivity due to hormonal changes. At the same time, many middle-aged people have accumulated years of caffeine use and chronic caffeine dependence. They need caffeine just to function at their baseline. Stopping caffeine produces withdrawal that feels intolerable. Continuing caffeine maintains a state of chronic stress hormone elevation that contributes to the health problems: cardiovascular disease, metabolic dysfunction, cognitive decline that increasingly affect people in middle age. In older adulthood, caffeine sensitivity increases further. The enzyme systems that metabolize caffeine are less efficient. Caffeine accumulates to higher levels. Caffeine's sleep-disrupting effects become severe. Many elderly people find that any afternoon caffeine completely prevents sleep that night. At the same time, elderly people often have medical conditions that are exacerbated by caffeine. Atrial fibrillation becomes more common with age, and caffeine can trigger episodes of heart palpitations. High blood pressure becomes more common, and caffeine exacerbates it. Osteoporosis becomes more common, and caffeine contributes to it. Anxiety and depression become more common, and caffeine can worsen both. Many elderly people report that reducing or eliminating caffeine improves their sleep, reduces their anxiety, stabilizes their heart rhythm, and improves their overall well-being. Yet many also find it very difficult to stop because they have become dependent on it. And many believe, wrongly, that caffeine no longer affects them, even though the evidence suggests otherwise. The trajectory of caffeine use across the lifespan often follows a predictable pattern: no use in childhood, increasing use from adolescence through young adulthood, peak use in early to middle adulthood, and often continued high use in older adulthood, despite increasing negative effects. This pattern is not inevitable. Some people use caffeine moderately throughout their lives, and some people recognize the negative effects and reduce their intake. But it is common. Sleep architecture: how caffeine reshapes your nighttime brain. Sleep is not a monolithic state, but a complex cycle of different sleep stages, each with its own neurochemistry, its own brain activity patterns, and its own functions. When caffeine disrupts sleep, it does not do so randomly. It does so in specific ways that alter particular aspects of sleep structure. Sleep proceeds through cycles, typically lasting 90 minutes in humans. Within each cycle, you move through light, sleep stages 1 and 2, then deep sleep, stage 3, also called slow wave sleep, then REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, when most dreams occur. A typical night of sleep includes 4 to 6 complete cycles. Each stage of sleep has important functions. Light sleep helps transition you between wakefulness and sleep. Deep sleep is when physical restoration occurs, when growth hormone is released, when memories from the day are consolidated into long-term storage. REM sleep is when emotional memories are processed, when the brain is highly active despite the body being paralyzed, when dreams occur and may serve important functions for emotional regulation and creativity. When adenosine accumulates throughout the day, it increasingly promotes the transition into sleep, particularly into deep sleep. Deep sleep is the stage most directly driven by adenosine accumulation and sleep pressure. The more adenosine you have, the deeper and more consolidated your slow-wave sleep tends to be. When caffeine blocks adenosine, it reduces sleep pressure and makes it harder to initiate sleep. But caffeine can also alter the structure of sleep if you do manage to fall asleep, despite the caffeine. People who consume caffeine in the afternoon or evening often find that when they finally fall asleep, they experience less deep sleep. The slow-wave sleep, that should be concentrated in the early cycles of the night, is reduced. REM sleep is also often affected by caffeine. Caffeine can suppress REM sleep, leading to increased REM sleep rebound when caffeine is finally eliminated or when the caffeine wears off. This is one reason why people who suddenly stop caffeine often experience vivid dreams or even nightmares. Their brain is compensating for the REM sleep suppression by producing extra REM sleep. The architectural changes to sleep caused by caffeine have consequences. The loss of deep sleep means less physical restoration, less consolidation of motor memories, less growth hormone release. The loss of REM sleep means less emotional memory consolidation, less emotional regulation, less opportunity for the brain's creative consolidation processes. Over time, chronic caffeine consumption leading to chronically fragmented or shallow sleep can contribute to cognitive decline. Sleep is when the brain's glymphatic system is most active, clearing out metabolic waste products that accumulate during waking. If your sleep is shallow or disrupted, this clearing is less efficient. Amyloid beta and tau proteins, implicated in Alzheimer's disease, accumulate more readily if sleep is poor. In fact, chronic sleep deprivation is emerging as one of the significant risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. And caffeine's sleep-disrupting effects make it a potentially relevant factor in long-term cognitive health. Another important aspect of sleep architecture affected by caffeine is sleep latency, the time it takes to fall asleep. Caffeine increases sleep latency. If you normally fall asleep within 15 minutes of getting into bed, but you had caffeine in the afternoon, you might find it takes 45 minutes or more to fall asleep. This might not seem like a big deal, but it is another manifestation of caffeine blocking the adenosine signal that should be driving you toward sleep. Caffeine also tends to increase brief awakenings during sleep. You might sleep through the night from the perspective of your conscious memory. You do not remember waking up, but EEG recordings of your brain would show multiple brief arousals throughout the night. These micro-awakenings disrupt sleep continuity and prevent you from achieving the deep, restorative sleep that requires sustained sleep without interruption. Some of the most interesting research on caffeine and sleep has examined the relationship between caffeine consumption and REM behavior disorder, a condition where people physically act out their dreams, instead of experiencing the normal sleep paralysis that accompanies REM sleep. Heavy caffeine users sometimes show increased symptoms of REM behavior disorder, suggesting that caffeine's effects on REM sleep can be significant enough to alter the motor control systems that normally paralyze you during REM sleep. All of these effects on sleep architecture mean that even if caffeine allows you to stay awake longer or feel more alert during the day, there is a metabolic cost at night. Your sleep is shallower, more fragmented, less restorative. Over time, this can contribute to chronic sleep deprivation, which has far-reaching consequences for cognitive function, emotional regulation, metabolic health, and immune function. The paradox of dependence. Feeling normal while compensating. One of the most insidious aspects of chronic caffeine use is that long-term users often report feeling normal while using caffeine and terrible when they stop. This creates a powerful incentive to continue using caffeine, even if it is clearly not serving the person's best interests. Understanding this paradox requires understanding how the brain adapts to chronic drug use. When you use caffeine regularly, your brain adapts by upregulating adenosine receptors, as we discussed earlier. But the brain's adaptation goes beyond simple receptor changes. It involves reorganization of neural networks, changes in gene expression, and shifts in baseline neurochemistry. Over weeks or months of daily caffeine use, your baseline level of adenosine receptor activation changes. Your brain's regulatory systems recalibrate around the constant presence of adenosine blockade. The network of adaptations becomes so extensive that when you are in a state of chronic caffeine consumption, your brain's chemistry in the presence of caffeine starts to feel normal to you. This is your brain on caffeine, is your baseline. Conversely, your brain without caffeine, after months of chronically blocked adenosine, feels abnormal. All those upregulated adenosine receptors are now receiving strong adenosine signals unopposed by caffeine. The baseline state feels wrong, feels like fatigue or dysfunction, even though this state was your original baseline before you ever started using caffeine. This creates what addiction researchers call feeling compensated. The long-term caffeine user feels normal while in a state of pharmacologically altered neurology. They feel impaired while in their original unaltered state. Their sense of normal has shifted. This is why people who stop caffeine after years of daily use often feel like something is seriously wrong with them. They go through withdrawal for a week or two, and during that time, they feel more tired and more unable to focus than they did when they were using caffeine. They might interpret this as evidence that they need caffeine to function properly, not realizing that they only need caffeine to function at the level that chronic caffeine consumption has made them feel normal, a level above their genuine baseline. If they persisted through the withdrawal for several weeks, their adenosine receptors would gradually normalize. Their adenosine signaling would return to baseline. Their baseline level of alertness and focus without caffeine would actually exceed what they felt like when they were using caffeine and going through the adaptation phase. But most people do not persist through withdrawal because the discomfort is real, and feeling terrible is a powerful motivator to relieve that suffering by returning to caffeine use. This dynamic, where the adapted state feels normal, the original state feels like dysfunction, and the transition between them feels like a descent into incapacity, is crucial to understanding caffeine dependence. It is why people continue using caffeine, even when they consciously recognize that it is disrupting their sleep or increasing their anxiety. They continue because not using caffeine feels worse, at least in the short term. This is also why caffeine dependence is so difficult to overcome without support. It is not just about willpower or discipline. It is about your brain's genuine reorganization around caffeine. Without understanding what is happening, without expecting the withdrawal, without having support through it, most people relapse into caffeine use within days. There is an interesting corollary to this phenomenon. Some research suggests that chronic caffeine users never fully return to their pre-caffeine baseline even after stopping for months or years. The changes in adenosine receptor density, the neural pathway reorganization, the shifts in gene expression, some of these might persist for extended periods or even permanently. This means that a person who was a heavy caffeine user for years might have a higher baseline of adenosine receptor density even years after stopping caffeine. They might be inherently more sensitive to adenosine signaling, or they might find that restarting caffeine after years of abstinence produces stronger effects than it did before they quit. The brain's memory of chronic drug exposure is not easy to erase. Caffeine and mental health. When a stimulant becomes a stressor, the relationship between caffeine and mental health is complex and bidirectional. Caffeine can improve mood and mental functioning in certain contexts, but it can also exacerbate mental health problems, particularly anxiety and depression, in others. To understand this relationship, we need to recognize that caffeine is fundamentally a central nervous system stimulant. It increases arousal, activates the sympathetic nervous system, and elevates stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. These effects can feel good to some people, particularly those with naturally low baseline arousal, or those struggling with depression-related fatigue. For someone with depression characterized by low mood, low energy, and low motivation, caffeine can provide temporary relief. The increase in dopamine signaling in reward networks can lift mood slightly. The increase in arousal can combat fatigue and apathy. The increased norepinephrine can enhance attention and focus. In these ways, caffeine can function almost like a mild antidepressant, boosting the very neurotransmitter systems that are dysregulated in depression. This is part of why so many people with depression use caffeine. It helps, at least in the short term. It provides a form of self-medication that is legal, socially acceptable, and readily available. However, there is a trap in this self-medication. Caffeine's effects on mood are temporary. As your brain adapts to chronic caffeine use, tolerance develops to the mood-lifting effects, just as it develops to the alerting effects. What once lifted your mood significantly provides less and less benefit. Meanwhile, the neural adaptations to chronic caffeine use continue. Your dopamine system becomes less responsive. Your baseline mood, without caffeine, actually decreases. Over time, people using caffeine to self-medicate depression often find themselves in a position where they need caffeine just to reach a baseline that is still below where they started. They have traded their original depressive baseline for a slightly less depressed baseline while dependent on caffeine, with the constant threat that stopping caffeine will send them back to the original baseline or worse. The situation is even more complicated when caffeine interacts with anxiety. While caffeine can help with depression-related apathy and low mood, it often worsens anxiety. By blocking adenosine in the amygdala and other anxiety processing regions, caffeine prevents the natural dampening of fear and anxiety signals that adenosine provides. For someone already prone to anxiety, caffeine can amplify existing anxiety significantly. Additionally, the physical effects of caffeine, increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased muscle tension, mimic the physical symptoms of anxiety. For someone with anxiety, these physical symptoms can trigger a feedback loop. Caffeine causes physical arousal. The physical arousal feels like anxiety, which causes more anxiety, which causes more physical arousal. This cycle can escalate into panic. This is particularly problematic for people with panic disorder or social anxiety, who are already hypervigilant to bodily sensations. For these individuals, caffeine is often a powerful anxiety trigger. The relationship between caffeine and anxiety becomes even more complicated when we consider that sleep disruption which caffeine causes, is itself an anxiety-promoting state. Lack of sleep increases emotional reactivity and reduces emotional regulation. The same circuitry that processes fear and anxiety becomes hypersensitive when you are sleep-deprived. So caffeine, by disrupting sleep, creates a state of elevated anxiety baseline. Then, the next day, the person feels anxious and tired, so they drink more caffeine to feel alert. But this further disrupts sleep, creating even more anxiety. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing. Many people with anxiety find that simply eliminating caffeine produces a dramatic improvement in their symptoms. Anxiety that seemed intractable, that was attributed to neuroticism, to their fundamental personality, to their genetic predisposition to anxiety, often improves substantially or disappears entirely when caffeine is removed. This is not because caffeine caused the underlying anxiety condition, but because chronic caffeine consumption was significantly exacerbating it. Caffeine also interacts with bipolar disorder in important ways. For people with bipolar disorder, caffeine can trigger manic or hypomanic episodes. The stimulant effect of caffeine, by increasing dopamine and norepinephrine, can push a person who is vulnerable to mania into a manic state. This is why many psychiatrists specifically advise their bipolar patients to eliminate caffeine. Similarly, for people with ADHD, the relationship with caffeine is complex. Some people with ADHD use caffeine as a form of self-medication because caffeine's dopaminergic effects somewhat approximate the effects of ADHD medications like stimulant amphetamines. For these individuals, caffeine can genuinely help with focus and impulse control. However, for other people with ADHD, caffeine tends to worsen symptoms. It can increase impulsivity, increase hyperactivity, reduce sustained attention. This variation relates again to individual differences in dopamine system, baseline, and sensitivity. People with ADHD have heterogeneous dopamine dysregulation. For some, the dopamine boost from caffeine helps. For others, it pushes dopamine signaling too high, actually worsening ADHD symptoms. The interaction between caffeine and psychotic disorders is also important. For people with schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders, caffeine is generally not recommended. The stimulant effects of caffeine can exacerbate psychotic symptoms, increasing paranoia, increasing the intensity of delusions or hallucinations. Additionally, caffeine's effects on sleep can be particularly problematic for people with psychotic disorders, as sleep disruption is a known trigger for psychotic episodes. Beyond specific mental health diagnoses, chronic caffeine use affects mood and anxiety in the general population in ways that are often not recognized or attributed to caffeine. Many people experience chronic, low-grade anxiety, irritability, or mood instability without recognizing that their daily caffeine consumption is a significant contributor. The brain adapts to chronic caffeine use by downregulating dopamine and other monoamine neurotransmitter systems, in some ways while upregulating them in others. The net result, after months of chronic use, is that the baseline emotional state without caffeine is often more negative than it was before caffeine use began. You become habituated to the dopamine boost from caffeine, so that normal activities feel less rewarding, less engaging, less worth doing. Your baseline mood decreases. Your baseline anxiety, in response to this lowered mood, increases. This is why people who successfully eliminate caffeine after years of use often report that their overall mood improves dramatically. Not just their acute mood while not using caffeine, but their baseline mood across days and weeks. The world feels more engaging, activities feel more rewarding, positive emotions feel more accessible. Anxiety becomes less prominent. It typically takes 2 to 4 weeks after stopping caffeine for the acute withdrawal to end. and for baseline mood to stabilize at a new, non-caffeinated level. But the improvements often continue for months, as the brain's various compensatory adaptations gradually normalize. People who make it through withdrawal often report that they cannot imagine going back to chronic caffeine use after experiencing how much better their mental health is without it. The question of benefits. Is caffeine worth it? At this point in our exploration, a natural question emerges. Is caffeine beneficial or harmful? Given everything we have discussed, the tolerance that develops, the disruption to sleep and circadian rhythms, the effects on anxiety and mood, the cardiovascular effects, the dependency, is there a case for caffeine at all? The honest answer is, it depends. Caffeine is neither universally good nor universally bad. Its value depends on your individual circumstances, your genetics, your current state of health, your goals, and your ability to use it without developing problematic dependence. There are genuine scenarios where caffeine is beneficial. A person who is sleep-deprived due to circumstances beyond their control, caring for a new baby, dealing with a temporary work crisis, can use caffeine to maintain sufficient alertness to get through the short-term difficulty. For a student in the final days before an important exam, caffeine can enhance focus and memory formation. For a long-distance driver who is dangerously fatigued, caffeine can prevent an accident. In acute situations where temporary wakefulness is needed, caffeine is genuinely useful. It solves the immediate problem of fatigue. The key is that these are acute situations, temporary uses of caffeine, not chronic daily consumption. There is also evidence that moderate caffeine consumption, roughly 200 to 400 milligrams per day, equivalent to 2 to 4 cups of coffee, is associated with some health benefits in the general population. Studies have found associations between moderate caffeine consumption and reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, reduced risk of certain cancers, reduced risk of Parkinson's disease, and improved cognitive function in aging. Some studies have also found a J-shaped or U-shaped relationship between caffeine consumption and mortality, suggesting that moderate consumption is associated with slightly lower overall mortality compared to no consumption or high consumption. However, these epidemiological associations need to be interpreted carefully. They are not evidence of cause and effect. People who consume moderate amounts of caffeine likely differ from people who consume no caffeine or very high amounts of caffeine in many ways beyond just caffeine consumption. They might exercise more, sleep better, have better genetics, have better socioeconomic status, or have other lifestyle factors that promote health. The association between moderate caffeine consumption and health benefits might reflect these other factors rather than being caused by the caffeine itself. Moreover, these population-level health associations describe average effects across populations. They do not tell us about individual effects. An individual person might experience caffeine as clearly harmful, disrupting their sleep, increasing their anxiety, exacerbating a cardiovascular condition, even if, on average, across a large population, moderate caffeine consumption is associated with health benefits. For the question of whether caffeine is worth it, we need to think about this from multiple time scales. In the short term, hours to days, caffeine is often beneficial. It improves alertness, focus, and performance. It helps you get through a long day or work through a difficult problem. Most people feel better when they consume caffeine than when they are in the midst of caffeine withdrawal. In the medium term, weeks to months, caffeine becomes more ambiguous. Yes, you are more alert and focused while using it, but you are also potentially experiencing sleep disruption, anxiety, cardiovascular stress. The trade-off between benefits and harms becomes less clear-cut. Some people find the trade-off worthwhile. Others find that the sleep disruption and anxiety become intolerable. In the long term, years to decades, the case for caffeine becomes weaker. The tolerance that develops means the short-term benefits fade. You are left with dependence, needing caffeine just to feel normal without the acutely noticeable benefits. The chronic sleep disruption, chronic stress hormone elevation, and chronic stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system accumulate over time, contributing to health problems. The disruption to circadian rhythms over decades potentially contributes to cognitive decline and metabolic dysfunction. Many people who use caffeine heavily in early and middle adulthood find that in older age, they desperately wish they could stop or reduce their caffeine use. But they cannot, because they have become so dependent on it. Their sleep is poor because of evening caffeine. They feel anxious and jittery from chronic stimulation. They experience heart palpitations, but the thought of going through caffeine withdrawal feels intolerable. They are trapped in a pattern established decades earlier. This long-term perspective suggests that while caffeine might be reasonable for occasional, acute use, chronic daily consumption is likely to be counterproductive over a lifetime. The costs accumulate more than the benefits do. Caffeine and productivity. What the research actually says. One of the most widely held beliefs about caffeine is that it enhances productivity. The assumption is so widespread that it is built into modern work culture. Coffee breaks are enshrined in labor agreements. Coffee machines are ubiquitous in offices. Entire coffee shop chains have built their business models around providing caffeine to workers, trying to increase their productivity. But what does the research actually show about caffeine's effects on productivity? The picture is more complicated than popular belief suggests. Yes, caffeine can enhance certain aspects of productivity in certain contexts. It improves focus and attention, as we discussed. It can improve performance on tasks that require sustained concentration. It can improve performance on tasks where speed is more important than accuracy. However, caffeine's effect on productivity depends heavily on the type of task and the context. For routine, well-practiced tasks that do not require much creativity or careful thought, caffeine can enhance performance. A person proofreading documents, entering data, or performing other repetitive work might work faster and more accurately on caffeine. But for complex, creative problem-solving tasks, the relationship is more complicated. As we discussed earlier, there is an inverted U relationship between arousal and performance. Moderate arousal is optimal for complex tasks. Too little arousal, and you cannot focus. Too much arousal, and your thinking becomes rigid and inflexible. Caffeine can provide the optimal arousal level, but it can also push you over it into excessive arousal, where your thinking becomes narrow, and you miss creative solutions. Research on caffeine's effects on creativity specifically has found mixed results. Some studies find that caffeine impairs creativity, particularly on tasks requiring divergent thinking, generating multiple possible solutions. Other studies find that caffeine has no effect on creativity or even enhances it. The differences likely relate to the individual differences we discussed earlier. How much arousal is optimal depends on the person and the task. There is also the question of long-term productivity versus short-term productivity. Yes, caffeine might boost your productivity for the next few hours. But if it disrupts your sleep that night, reducing your sleep quality, or causing you to sleep shorter, then your next day's productivity will be lower than it would have been without the caffeine. In fact, the sleep disruption caused by afternoon caffeine often reduces the next day's productivity more than the previous day's productivity was enhanced. People who use caffeine chronically often report that they believe they are more productive on caffeine. But when they actually try eliminating caffeine for a few weeks and see how they feel, They often discover that their actual productivity is similar or even higher without caffeine. The perceived productivity boost is partly real. They are more alert, more stimulated. But part of it is also that the stimulated state feels different and more active, which can be mistaken for higher productivity. Moreover, the type of productivity that caffeine enhances is often not the type of productivity that matters most. Working longer hours at a frenetic pace, powered by caffeine, is not the same as working on the most important things, thinking deeply about problems, and producing high-quality work. In fact, there is evidence that some of the best creative and intellectual work happens when people are not in a state of high arousal or stimulation. Many artists, writers, and scientists describe their most important insights coming during periods of quiet, unstimulated reflection, rather than during periods of stimulated productivity. The productivity trap with caffeine is similar to the productivity trap with email and messaging apps. These tools feel like they increase productivity till you are responding quickly, staying busy, getting things done. But they often decrease actual productivity by fragmenting attention and preventing deep work. The global caffeine narrative, a drug woven into civilization. Caffeine is unique among psychoactive drugs in that it is legal, widely available, socially encouraged, and woven into the fabric of modern civilization in ways that are often invisible. We do not typically think of caffeine as a drug in the same category as alcohol or nicotine, let alone illegal drugs. It is just caffeine, as innocuous as water or food. But caffeine is absolutely a drug. It is a psychoactive substance that changes consciousness and behavior. It is addictive. It has withdrawal effects. It has health consequences, both positive and negative, depending on dose, individual factors, and context. It deserves the same careful consideration we give to any other drug. The fact that caffeine is so accepted and normalized reveals something interesting about how societies construct categories around drugs. A substance's legal status and social acceptance are not necessarily reflections of how dangerous or important it is. They are reflections of historical accident, political decisions, and cultural evolution. Caffeine became legal and normalized in Europe and America in the 17th and 18th centuries because it arrived at a time when these societies were undergoing rapid industrialization and development. Caffeine was useful for these societies. It helped workers stay alert during long work shifts. It helped intellectuals maintain focus during extended work. It became integrated into the economic and cultural machinery of modernity. If caffeine had arrived in modern times instead of the 1600s, it would likely be treated very differently. It would probably be available only by prescription, classified as a medication for narcolepsy or ADHD, rather than sold as a beverage. Its addictive potential, its effects on sleep, its cardiovascular effects would make it seem obviously like something that should be carefully regulated. But because caffeine arrived centuries ago, because it became intertwined with coffee and tea cultures, because it serves the interests of modern industrial economies, keeping workers alert and productive, it is treated not as a drug that requires careful management, but as a simple beverage with minimal health relevance. The global caffeine narrative reveals our ambivalent relationship with consciousness and with stimulation. We want to be awake and alert, but we also want rest and peace. Caffeine represents a kind of bargain with modernity. You can have sustained wakefulness and productivity, but you must give up the natural rhythm of sleep and wakefulness that your body evolved to follow. You must constantly stimulate your nervous system to stay ahead of the fatigue that is the natural consequence of sleep disruption. For many people, this bargain is struck without explicit choice. Caffeine is so ubiquitous, so normalized, that you become a caffeine user almost by default. You do not decide to become dependent on a psychoactive drug. It just happens. You have a cup of coffee one morning because you are tired, and then the next morning you feel worse without it, so you have another cup. By the time you realize you are dependent on it, you have already constructed your life around it. The global caffeine narrative also reflects inequalities in the world. Caffeine is primarily grown in the global south in Ethiopia, Brazil, Vietnam, Colombia, and other developing nations. It is primarily consumed in the global north, in wealthy developed countries in Europe, North America, and East Asia. The workers who grow and harvest caffeine are often poorly paid and work in difficult conditions. The wealthy nations that consume it enjoy the cognitive and economic benefits of the stimulation. There is also a gender dimension to caffeine's role in modern society. Caffeine has been particularly important for women entering the modern workforce in significant numbers. As women took on both work and domestic responsibilities, without the domestic support systems that had previously been available, caffeine became a tool for managing the impossible demands on their time and energy. Many women have been encouraged to use caffeine to keep up in both work and domestic spheres. This has not been entirely negative. Caffeine has been a tool that allowed women greater participation in the workforce. But it has also meant that women, disproportionately burdened with impossible expectations, have become dependent on a stimulant drug to meet those expectations. The problem is not caffeine itself, but the expectations and circumstances that make caffeine feel necessary, alternatives and strategies. Navigating a caffeinated world. Given everything we have discussed, what are the alternatives? If someone wants to be alert and focused but does not want to depend on caffeine, what can they do? The most obvious alternative is sleep. Adequate sleep is the most powerful enhancer of alertness, focus, and cognitive function available. Nothing caffeine does comes close to what actual sleep does. 8 hours of sleep produces better alertness the next day than caffeine could possibly produce. But sleep requires something that modern life makes increasingly difficult: time. It requires prioritizing sleep over other demands. It requires saying no to some opportunities to say yes to sleep. For many people, prioritizing sleep is not possible, at least not in the short term. Work demands, family demands, social obligations, all of these can make getting adequate sleep seem impossible. But the recognition that sleep is essential, that skipping sleep to do more work is ultimately counterproductive, is important. Beyond sleep, there are other ways to enhance alertness and focus. Physical exercise is remarkably powerful for enhancing alertness. 30 minutes of moderate exercise can produce effects on attention and focus that rival caffeine's effects, without the sleep-disrupting consequences. Morning sunlight exposure is powerful for enhancing alertness and supporting circadian rhythm alignment. Even without caffeine, exposure to bright light in the morning produces a robust increase in alertness that lasts throughout the day. Social engagement is another powerful enhancer of alertness. Conversation with others, collaborative work, social connection, all of these activate arousal systems and enhance focus. Many people can work alone, feeling tired and unfocused, but become immediately alert when other people are present. Cold exposure, taking a cold shower, splashing cold water on your face, even just being in a cold room, produces an acute arousal response. It is not as sustained as caffeine's effects, but for moments when you need acute alertness, cold exposure can be effective. Breaks and rest are paradoxically important for maintaining sustained focus and alertness. Working continuously without breaks produces mental fatigue and declining performance. But taking brief breaks, even just 5 to 10 minutes, can restore mental energy and allow you to work better in subsequent periods. Structured work periods with clear goals and measures of progress also enhance focus. Working on vaguely defined tasks with no clear endpoint produces wandering attention and low motivation. But working on clearly defined, achievable goals produces better focus and more sustainable productivity. None of these alternatives are quite as easy or as quick as drinking caffeine. Caffeine works immediately and requires only seconds of effort. These alternatives require more time and planning, but they also do not produce the long-term costs that caffeine produces: no sleep disruption, no anxiety, no dependence, no tolerance. For people who want to reduce their caffeine consumption, but who are currently dependent on it, the best approach is gradual reduction rather than abrupt cessation. Stopping caffeine suddenly produces withdrawal that is unpleasant enough to make most people relapse. But tapering caffeine, gradually reducing consumption by 10 to 25% every few days or every week, allows the brain to adapt gradually, minimizing withdrawal symptoms. During a caffeine reduction or elimination process, it is particularly important to prioritize sleep, exercise, and light exposure to compensate for the loss of caffeine's alerting effects. Otherwise, the person becomes exhausted, struggles through withdrawal, and is more likely to relapse. For people who want to continue using caffeine, but do so in a way that minimizes negative consequences, some strategies are worth considering. Front-loading caffeine consumption earlier in the day minimizes sleep disruption, consuming most of your caffeine before 10 or 11 a.m. rather than spread throughout the day. Taking caffeine in cycles, using it heavily for 1 to 2 weeks, then taking 1 to 2 weeks off, slows tolerance development. Consuming caffeine with food, rather than on an empty stomach, reduces the acute spike in caffeine levels and produces a more gradual rise, reducing jitteriness and side effects. Regular exercise, adequate sleep, and morning light exposure become even more important. If you are using caffeine, they provide competing sources of alertness and arousal, potentially allowing you to use less caffeine. They also counter some of caffeine's negative health effects. The phenomenology of caffeine, what it feels like, from the inside. Up to this point, we have been discussing caffeine from an external, objective perspective. How it works biochemically, how it affects sleep architecture, how it disrupts circadian rhythms. But there is also the subjective experience of caffeine, the qualitative feel of it, from the inside of consciousness. For most people, the experience of caffeine begins with anticipation. You see a cup of coffee, or you smell coffee brewing, and you begin to anticipate the effect. Your brain starts producing dopamine in response to the anticipated reward, even before you consume the coffee. This anticipatory dopamine is partly biological, triggered by learned associations between coffee and the effects of caffeine. But it is also partly psychological. You believe that coffee will make you feel better, and this belief itself produces neurological changes. Then comes the moment of consumption. The warmth of the cup, the ritual, the taste, the sensation of drinking something. For regular users, this ritual becomes deeply embedded in habit patterns. Many people find that simply going through the ritual of making and drinking coffee produces effects even if the coffee is decaffeinated. The placebo effect is real and significant. In the first few minutes after consuming caffeine, there is usually not much subjective effect. The caffeine has not yet reached the brain in significant quantities, but after 15 to 45 minutes, depending on individual factors, the effects begin to be noticeable. For first-time users or occasional users, the effects can be quite dramatic. There is a sense of increased alertness, a quickening of thought, a sense that the world is coming into focus. There is often a slightly jittery feeling, a sense of physical activation, heart rate increasing, muscles becoming more tense and ready for action. There might be a slight euphoria or sense of well-being. The world becomes more interesting, and you become more motivated to engage with it. For chronic users, the effects are typically much more subtle. There is a sense that thinking becomes clearer, that attention becomes more focused, that fatigue recedes into the background. But there is often not the dramatic activation or euphoria that new users experience. Instead, there is more a sense of returning to normal, of things becoming as they should be. The experience of caffeine varies depending on what someone is doing while caffeinated. If they are doing something engaging and interesting, caffeine seems to enhance the engagement. The activity becomes more absorbing, more rewarding. If they are doing something boring or stressful, caffeine seems to amplify the boredom or stress. The activity becomes more intense, but not necessarily more pleasant. For many people, the subjective peak of caffeine effects comes about 30 to 45 minutes after consumption. After that, the effects gradually fade as caffeine is metabolized. By 3 to 5 hours after consumption, depending on individual metabolism, the effects are typically minimal for most people, though slow metabolizers might still feel significant effects 8 to 10 hours later. For people who are caffeine dependent and who miss their usual caffeine consumption, the experience is quite different. Without caffeine, after days or weeks of regular use, there is a sense of fog, of difficulty concentrating, of fatigue that seems to pervade everything. The world feels duller, less interesting, less worth engaging with. Nothing feels rewarding. Motivation for anything is difficult to muster. This state is so unpleasant that it powerfully motivates a return to caffeine. For people going through caffeine withdrawal, the subjective experience can be quite uncomfortable. Headaches are common. There is a deep fatigue that coffee and rest seem not to alleviate. There is often mood disturbance, irritability, sadness, anxiety. There is difficulty concentrating and a sense of being mentally foggy. These withdrawal symptoms typically peak at 24 to 48 hours after the last caffeine consumption and gradually improve over the following days and weeks. The subjective experience of caffeine also changes across the day due to circadian rhythms. Caffeine consumed in the morning, when your body is already ramping up wakefulness, produces a sense of smooth enhancement. Caffeine consumed in the evening, when your body is trying to wind down, produces a sense of fighting against your biology, a jittery and somewhat unpleasant activation rather than smooth enhancement. For many people, the most striking subjective shift happens when they successfully reduce their caffeine consumption after being dependent on it. For the first week or two, as we have discussed, they feel worse withdrawal is uncomfortable. But around 2 to 4 weeks after stopping, as the acute withdrawal fades and the brain begins to recalibrate without chronic adenosine blockade, many people report a dramatic shift in their subjective experience. The world becomes more interesting again. Activities feel more rewarding. They have more energy than they did while dependent on caffeine, even though they are no longer consuming caffeine. Sleep becomes deeper and more restorative. They feel more emotionally balanced. This subjective shift can be quite striking because it challenges the assumption that had been operating for years, the assumption that they needed caffeine to feel normal and function well. The realization that they feel better without caffeine, after experiencing the unpleasantness of withdrawal, can be genuinely transformative. The neuroscience of wakefulness without caffeine. It is easy to think of wakefulness as something that requires caffeine, that fatigue and sleep pressure are natural forces that must be actively resisted with stimulants. But this is not entirely accurate. Wakefulness and sleep are both active states, both supported by complex neurological systems. You can be awake and alert without caffeine. You can stay awake all night if your brain needs to, if there is sufficient novelty and stimulation and motivation. Caffeine just makes sustained wakefulness easier and more comfortable. The systems that promote wakefulness operate through multiple neurotransmitters and neural networks, of which the adenosine system is just one. The locus coeruleus, which produces norepinephrine, produces an active signal for wakefulness and attention. The dorsal raphe nucleus and other serotonin-producing regions support arousal. The orexin system in the hypothalamus, which produces orexin, also called hypocretin, is crucial for maintaining wakefulness throughout the day. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, through its output of circadian signals, supports wakefulness during the day and sleep at night. All of these systems are active during normal wakefulness, even without caffeine. They maintain consciousness and keep you engaged with the world. Caffeine does not create wakefulness from scratch. It enhances existing wakefulness-promoting systems by removing adenosine's inhibitory influence on them. This means that if you have adequate sleep, if your circadian rhythm is well aligned, if you are engaged in something interesting, if you are physically active, if you are social, all of these conditions activate your natural wakefulness systems powerfully, without any need for caffeine. The problem is that modern life often does not provide these conditions. Many people are sleep-deprived, circadian disrupted, engaged in boring activities, sedentary, and isolated. In these conditions, natural wakefulness systems are not activated sufficiently to maintain the level of alertness required by modern demands. This is where caffeine becomes appealing. It artificially activates wakefulness systems when natural conditions are not sufficient to do so. But relying on caffeine in conditions of insufficient sleep, circadian disruption, and lack of engagement is like using stimulants to run a sprint when you have not eaten or slept. It works in the short term, but at the cost of further depleting your systems. The better approach is to address the underlying conditions, getting adequate sleep, aligning your circadian rhythm, engaging in activities that activate your interest and motivation, being physically active, maintaining social connection. In these conditions, your natural wakefulness systems work powerfully, and you maintain alertness without relying on caffeine. The future of caffeine: biotechnology, attitudes, and change. As we look toward the future, the role of caffeine in human life will likely change. There are several factors that might influence this. First, there is increasing scientific awareness of caffeine's effect. As the research on caffeine's impacts on sleep, circadian rhythm, anxiety, and long-term health accumulates, public understanding of these effects is slowly shifting. More people are becoming aware that the afternoon caffeine that helps them get through their workday is the same caffeine that will prevent them from sleeping well that night, reducing their capacity to work well the next day. This awareness might lead to changing attitudes and behaviors around caffeine use. Second, there is biotechnology. Researchers are developing new compounds that might produce some of the alerting effects of caffeine without some of the negative effects. There are compounds that selectively block certain adenosine receptors while leaving others intact, potentially producing focused alertness without the cardiovascular or anxiety effects. There are compounds that produce arousal without disrupting sleep as severely as caffeine does. Whether these compounds will ultimately be developed, approved, and widely used remains uncertain, but the possibility exists. Third, there is changing work culture. Some organizations are becoming aware that perpetually sleep-deprived, caffeine-dependent workers are not actually optimal for productivity. They are exploring alternative work structures that allow people more sleep and better circadian alignment. Remote work, flexible schedules, and reduced work hours are becoming more common, particularly after the disruptions of the pandemic. These changes could reduce the structural imperative for caffeine use that exists in conventional work environments. Fourth, There is growing interest in contemplative practices, meditation, mindfulness, yoga, that can enhance alertness and mental clarity without drugs. Some organizations are beginning to recognize that regular meditation practice might be a more sustainable way to enhance cognitive function than chronic caffeine consumption. It is hard to predict whether these trends will fundamentally change caffeine's role in society. Caffeine has been too useful to too many people for too long to disappear. But it is possible that we might move toward more moderate, intentional use of caffeine, using it occasionally when genuinely useful rather than daily out of dependence.